Back in 2012, the famous film critic Roger Ebert declared video games could never be art. More specifically, because they were driven by points and extrinsic rewards, this lacked the creative or introspective depth of other mediums. And goddamn, you just know Neil Druckmann and the rest of the Oscar bait hacks took that personally. The Last of Us is the most overrated game of all time, and it's not even close. Even ignoring all its re-releases, remakes, and whatever else Sony needed to fill that particular financial quarter, The Last of Us, I'm not going to call it part 1 because it doesn't even deserve to be said in the same breath as The Godfather, which it is so obviously trying to imitate, is a completely derivative, lukewarm take that any media studies student could produce within post-apocalyptic fiction. Druckmann and Bruce Straley clearly took Children of Men and The Road by Cormac McCarthy and smashed it together to the overwhelming fanfare of game critics who could finally point and feel good about themselves. We've done it, guys. We've achieved high art, and now we too can look down on inferior products. We no longer have to suffer through David Cage's latest bumbling attempt at emulating other people's work, like Racism Equals Bad or The Average Day in French Quebec. I'm a huge horror fan. It's probably come across in work I've done over the years, even though this isn't exactly a film channel, but I love everything from the goofy camp of the original Evil Dead trilogy to airing out what's probably the worst relationship ever in the broad daylight of Midsummer, to the crushing emotional devastation of Martyrs, or weird experimental stuff like Giulio Ducournau's work in Raw and Titan. Even if you're not a big cinephile, you've probably heard the term elevated horror through the average video essay or review that's emerged in the past few years. I won't go too far into it here, but the implication of elevated horror in films like Get Out, The Babadook, The Witch, Mother, or The Substance is that these films are more superior to their contemporaries, that in having some implicit artistic merit that immediately elevates them, as it were, above the rest of the genre. This is stupid, and much like many subgenres, made up by theorists to feel good about themselves. Horror as a whole genre has had such a poor reputation in the wider film critic community, for want of a better word, because its reputation has been inextricably tied to trash, exploitation, and the B-grade pulp of decades long past. Don't get me wrong, I think Sharknado is hilarious, as much as the next guy, but to dismiss an entire genre because of a subset of films that don't personally appeal to highbrow critics is so stupid. Imagine if the Academy or Cannes or whatever came out and declared that period romances are inherently bad. Of course, various analysts, critics, and the like are incapable of this kind of introspection, so they created this idea that films they do like somehow exist outside of the broader genre. Much like the high opinion they have of themselves, so too do these particular films. As if, the 2010s was the first time ever horror cinema understood what a theme is. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Art is a term that has become so overused, even long before video games even existed, that for most people nowadays, we have some vague understanding of what it is or isn't, but can't really articulate why. Modern art is a whole other rabbit hole that we won't get into here, but the reason I bring this up is because Naughty Dog, Quantic Dream, Sony Santa Monica, Supermassive, Ready at Dawn, Kojima, and countless other developers and studios out there have this incessant, desperate need to be seen as high art, and not one of those silly little video games like the Pac-Man and the Italian plumber guy. We come full circle back to The Last of Us. There isn't a single example that better encapsulates this embarrassing desire to be seen as superior to other video games than Druckmann's misery fetish of The Last of Us, and more to the point, The Last of Us Part 2. I don't want this to become a full breakdown or critique or anything, because frankly, I don't care enough to talk about it for that long, but to briefly summarize the first game, you have the most cliched premise imaginable of miracle girl with cure that represents hope for humanity. I'll give the world building some credit in that I think using cordyceps, a very real fungus, and pure nightmare fuel as the basis for the zombie analog was a pretty nice touch, but there's really nothing original about the rest of it. Let's ignore the giant leap in logic that a fringe terrorist group whose leader you find injured at the beginning of the game could have the logistical capability to even find, let alone distribute a mass cure to supposedly fix the world. Let's ignore the fact the game tries to pretend this is a big moral conundrum when it's really not. The Fireflies had no hope, and good on Joel for being selfish, even if the writers want to pretend the Fireflies' stupid pipe dream had a hope in hell of coming to fruition. Let's ignore the fact that post-apocalyptic means you're obligated to throw cannibals in there somewhere. Who wants to bet Australian Druckmann just lifted this straight out of that scene in The Road? Or it falls back on the laziest, most tired message imaginable. Oh, wow, I guess humans are the real monsters, guys. Let's ignore the brutal, nihilistic violence, or how Joel and Ellie are just about as stereotypical as it gets. Big, gruff guy who's done terrible things to get by, juxtaposed by a plucky, bright-eyed girl with some of that 2010 snark thrown in for good measure. For the record, I played The Last of Us at the time. I thought it was good, sure, but nothing particularly remarkable. Let's be real, even Uncharted's success relied on the fact they were just aping classics like Indiana Jones and pulp adventure novels. Naughty Dog has never been ambitious with their gameplay mechanics. Literally the first game I can remember playing was Crash Team Racing, but as fun as their games were, let's not pretend they were particularly deep even for their time. But then we come to the sequel. Oh boy. For context, my feelings around this game were kind of an inversion to everyone else's. I didn't see the leaks at the time. Obviously I heard they happened, but I was able to go into it completely blind and experience the whole thing for what it was worth. Funnily enough, my reaction right after playing it was that it was A, certainly bold to try, and I do mean try, and do what the story attempted, and that B, it was challenging and not something that really anyone could say they enjoyed. Unlike a wine, for example, The Last of Us Part 2 did not age very well at all. As I thought about it more and more, not engaging with the media cycle or outrage or grifters or any of that stuff, the more I began to realize how stupid and conceited the whole thing was, and what a pretentious, hypocritical knob Neil Druckmann really is. Stereotypes and cliches in the first game are one thing, dramatic license and the suspension of disbelief is one thing, but the moment you start to think about this game with even the slightest bit of scrutiny, the whole thing falls apart. First of all, let's just say that even though I pointed out how stupid that supposed moral conundrum of the first game was, and people were deluding themselves into thinking it was this grand moral question for humanity, whether they love Joel or not, doesn't matter, because the leaps in logic Part 2 had to take for anything to happen is just, man, it beggars belief. First of all, it relies on the fact that Abby coincidentally bumps into Tommy and Joel, that they then tell a group of armed strangers who they are.
Why don't you say whatever speech you got rehearsed? Get this over with.
That Mel, a trained medic who is priceless for post-apocalyptic armed forces, is heavily pregnant and goes out into the field. That you can literally stand there and watch as she climbs over fences that push into her belly, which would do catastrophic damage to the baby. That she's only pregnant in the first place because of the laziest possible parallel with Dina. Do you see it, guys? Do you have empathy yet, my fellow gamers? That Tommy somehow survives being shot in the head on his own in Seattle with zero help, that Ellie magically makes her way to the hospital in a flashback with no issues, and Joel happens to arrive at the same time, that Abby's dad, who was ironically enough whitewashed from a random black guy in the first game, saves a zebra because, hey, look, it's like Joel with the giraffe. Could it be they're the same? That Ellie makes her way to another entirely different part of the country and arrives just in time to duel Abby. That Abby and Lev didn't die of hunger or disease or dehydration or whatever when strung up by a bunch of hillbilly slavers. That the game is supposedly a reflection on empathy, but Abby feels nothing for what she did to Joel and then suddenly wakes up one morning figuring she needs to save some people she's been ruthlessly slaughtering for years. That Ellie absolutely slaughters, guts, eviscerates, disembowels, and whatever other descriptor you want to use, so many nameless people on her quest, but then suddenly gets all weepy and introspective at the actual cause of her anger, because come on guys, revenge bad, genocide bad, cycle of violence bad. Oh, thank God we have Naughty Dog here to teach us such groundbreaking moral lessons. Oh, unless you feel attacked, I guess. Like, holy shit. I don't even care that Druckmann couldn't resist inserting a line from Dina in a synagogue about survivors when you're in a world where billions died horrific, painful deaths only 20 years before. That the stupid fat white guy with the whole sandwiches thing is obviously a straw man of the kind of people Druckmann, games media, and all the other people who have completely lost touch with reality think are. That there's stupid, indulgent sex scenes that add nothing and mean nothing other than the fact it's what films do, I guess. I've said before, I could not care less about the belief in a culture war, because even if you ignore all that, whether it's true or not, this game is so stupid, so poorly written, a torturous experience of terrible people doing terrible things to each other in a nihilistic orgy that, man, it's hard to believe there are actually people who thought this should have ever been made. That Identity is Shield from Criticism video I did last year is such a brilliant case study for this game in particular, because the fact there was anti-Semitic backlash, or transphobia, or the typical SJW woke bad discourse or whatever, all of the criticism, the plot holes, the illogical writing, all of it was brushed under the rug, and people hailed this game as the equivalent of Schindler's List. My god, are we really this screwed as a species? What the hell happened to media literacy? At this point, you might be asking, was this video just an excuse to go to fucking town on what a hack Neil Druckmann and all his film school reject buddies are? What does this have to do with art? It has everything to do with art, mate, because The Last of Us is so desperate to be seen as higher, more important than those silly little kids games or the Fort blocks that everyone involved cram their heads so far up their ass, they are incapable of seeing what a miserable, contradictory, self-indulgent mess they created. At least with David Cage, he's just a hack, a misogynistic buffoon who thinks everything he touches is gold, whereas the average Wattpad fanfiction would do a better job handling characters and thematic depth. Neil Druckmann and all the other writing staff at Naughty Dog, Haley Gross, who was hired to make themselves feel legit, like they're avant-garde filmmakers, where in fact they're just sad, delusional hacks. Man, you could not have asked for a better example of how desperate video games want to be seen as high art. What makes it worse is that it just had to be so goddamn miserable. Just get it over with. Let Ellie and Abby and Joel and Tommy and whoever kill each other. What a fucking shit show. There are many games and various media that I would call high art, just as I'm sure you have plenty you can think of too. What I think is telling about this whole thing, however, is that these did not set out with the sole purpose of trying to be art. That was a result of the creative process. What The Last of Us Part 2, and undoubtedly their new game Intergalactic will prove to be too, and all the other entries in the cinematic slop genre show is that simply trying to emulate film and things you once read in writing lesson somewhere does not a genre-defining masterpiece make. Silent Hill, Dishonored 2, Disco Elysium, KOTOR 2, so many examples of great games. They weren't concerned about being jerked off by games media or being likened to the Citizen Kane of Dark Souls or whatever. The people made amazing games, really lightning in a bottle, that stood the test of time, which outrage culture and a miserable derivative train wreck will not. Write stories and create things for yourself more than anything else, not for the prestige or self-importance you think it'll bring you. Naughty Dog have already well and truly gone the way of BioWare. Hey, that was a little heavy, so to finish off on a lighter note, I'd like to recommend some movie games that are actually deserving of your time and money. They do stuff with games as a medium, or tell authentic, original stories with only a fraction of the budget Sony has, so maybe consider giving them a little look-see. A Plague Tale Requiem. I wrote a Steam review at the time laying out how much I adore this game, but Charlotte McBurney gives the performance of a lifetime as Amicia. I don't want to say too much, it's just special. Go into it blind. You can thank me later. Speaking of blindness, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Much like my love of films brave enough to use natural light, I have huge respect for games that experiment with the form, and particularly how this game uses binaural sound design. This is a special game that certainly won't be for everyone, and I know the sequel, even with Heilong's involvement, flew too close to the sun. Still, this game really was singular. It regularly goes on sale too. Signalis. This isn't really a cinematic or movie game per se, but this is probably the only chance I'll get to talk about it. I loved Signalis. If you're an old school survival horror fan like Clock Tower, Resident Evil, or Silent Hill, this is the game for you. It was made by 2 indie developers, and it is clearly the result of passion that AAA is so obviously lacking. Great stuff. Alice Madness Returns. I played this way back in the day, but it's a great example of a clear creative vision and, if anything, a great story that exists within a pretty mediocre game. It's sad that American McGee never got the rights back from EA to do Asylum. Madness Returns is special. Duskborn. No, I'm just kidding. What Remains of Edith Finch? I don't think this is the best thing ever like some people do, but rather than glazing that game company for making Journey a million times over, as games media has been doing for years, this particular game is an example of what the indie scene can achieve. It's essentially just a series of experimental vertical slices, but it's so creative and sincere, we're unlikely to see anything like it again. Disco Elysium. It's ironic and almost cruel about what happened to Kurvitz and the dream team behind this game. Do not support the Zaum that exists in name only today, but this was the kind of thing that only comes around once in a very, very long time. I don't know why you're watching this channel if you need me to explain why I love this RPG and weird experimental game. It's bursting with so much personality and soul, and I've said from the start, I think it's far better than Planescape Torment in every way. It's something I'd recommend to just about anyone, and like many of the greats, can only exist as a video game. That's it, no wise words to round out this one, just that you should think twice before buying something simply because of the number of Game of the Year awards it's won. The world doesn't need any more miserable games made by miserable people.